In the previous video, we talked about long-term memory and the ways to make you and help you memorize and remember things. So if something has experience or meaning to you, you're much more likely to remember it. If it's a novelty and it's unique and it stands out to you, much more likely to remember. If it's an emotional experience, like you're emotionally connected to the situation or a story, much more likely to remember it. If it's through repetition and rehearsal, least likely to remember it. And unfortunately, you'll see in school a lot of times, especially like math and science, there's a lot of repetition and rehearsal, repetition and rehearsal. So it doesn't stick as well. That's why it might be a little bit easier sometimes to remember stories in history or reading a story in literature, and that can come alive or in a foreign language. Now, we're going to talk about how what helps us retrieve information from our long-term memory. How do we retrieve it? How do we recall things? And we said the long-term memory is like a file cabinet. And you have all these files. And we also said that if you categorize these files, it's much easier to find it. So the way your brain works through schemas is, and we're going to talk about that, these mental images, it starts categorizing and putting things in compartments in the long-term memory. And we're going to talk about how do you retrieve it and give it meaning. Well, one trick is chunking. Chunking is very, very important. It's organization of information to familiar or manageable units. So you guys have noticed, and we've talked about this, that phone numbers tend to be like 314, which is the area code, and it'll be a 7-digit number like 564, 3848, something like that. Well, and that originally was created based on psychology of the memory that the brain tends to remember things about 7 units of information plus or minus 2. We're actually finding out that most research is pointing to it's probably more like 5 bits of information plus or minus 2. So, however, 7 seems to be the magic number right now. So if you chunk it, you break it into pieces. And chunking could be when you learn something, you see a series of numbers, you read part of a book, you watch a show, anything. If you break it into pieces and spread out over time, you're much more likely to retain it and remember it as opposed to rehearsal and retreat and just saying it over and over and over. However, practice does help. Now, mnemonic devices is a sentence or an acronym that helps us memorize a string of words. An acronym is letters that form another word or another sound. So we think about, when I taught world history, used to learn mania about World War I. Militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the assassination of King Ferdinand. Those are the causes of World War I, and the assassination of King Ferdinand is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. It's the breaking point. So that is an acronym. You guys probably know, as you can see in the picture, every good boy does fine. EGBDF, EGBDF. And you can learn that your notes. You can learn everything from guitar positioning and music to numbers. And you can do all kinds of mnemonic devices. You guys know your compass rose. When you're looking at a compass, you get north up, so it's never eat soggy waffles or never eat slimy worms when you're a kid. So you could create mnemonic devices for yourself to help you remember things, and it gives things meaning and connects it with previous knowledge and experience that helps you recall it from the memory. And those are some of the tricks that you could use, and they're actually really just good quality ways of retrieving long-term memory. Now, something else to be aware of is when is your memory the strongest? So we're going to look at the data here. So the positioning and the sequence. So when you learn something, as you can see on the data chart at the bottom, if we were to list words or numbers or even learn in a class, you're going to tend to remember things at the beginning, and we call that the primary effect. Tendency to recall the initial items in a series of information, and then at the end, which is the recency effect. So think of most recent. The intermediate, the middle, is where you tend to lose information. It starts to come back up at the end. So the primary effect of tendency is to recall initial items in a series of informations. And the recency effect is the tendency to recall the last items in a series of information. So you'll probably remember the beginning of the class and the end of the class. The middle of the class is where people start to forget. Also, even a semester, you'll see teachers tend to remember, and you guys build relationships. Initially, you have your first impressions, and then teachers and other people, they remember what you did at the end of a class if something's ending. And they'll forget a lot of stuff in the middle. And that's why it's really important to make a good first impression and a good last impression, especially when it comes to school or jobs or anything. Okay, and finally, we've looked at this idea, this very important idea of What are mental images, ideas, and objects called? And that is a schema. A schema is when the brain organizes bits of information into a mental representation of the world. Now, whether we like it or not, these mental representations that we form are based on our experience and knowledge that we have from the past. So, unfortunately, there's some discussion and arguments about if we create bias and we pick up messages in our culture and our media that create schemas. So, for example, tall people tend to be meaner and scarier. Well, that could be a message we're picking up in the media. We always picture big men are the bad guys. And I'm making this up. Or people with long hair are nice, and people with short hair are not. And you build these mental images, and they're not necessarily right. What happens is your brain creates schemas and what's called heuristics, we'll go into later, where it just logically your brain has to come up with mental images very quickly because you're processing lots and lots of information in your brain through long-term and short-term memory. So when you try to recall things, it's going to build on your prior experience. Now remember, we said those memories are not always correct. That's why it's really important for us to write things down, take notes, and try to practice and create connections between prior knowledge we have. But on your own, you're constantly walking into this world where you see things visually in schemas. So you have a visual, if I said desk, you'll picture a desk in your head. If I said chair, you'll picture what a chair looks like to you. And also that applies to people and animals and so forth and so on. So what's really cool about schemas, though, is once we're aware of this, then we can start thinking through this and we go into bigger, deeper questions about the power of psychology and schemas. How do we go against our schemas, or how do we shape our schemas in a more positive way? And it takes practice and awareness, and that's the power of psychology.